The soil around plot 114C was pushed up, not down, up, like something underneath had pressed against it from below. I stood at the edge of the grave and looked at it for a long time before I touched anything. The mound was displaced outward, in a rough ring around the perimeter of the plot, the way soil moves when pressure comes from the center. Not erosion, not animal burrowing. The direction was wrong for both. Rain moves soil downhill. Animals dig channels. This was radial, even, circular, pushing away from the middle. The headstone was undisturbed. The flower vase cemented to the base was still upright. The plastic daisies inside still arranged the way the family had left them 3 months ago, when Dolores Van was buried. I took out my phone and photographed it. Then I got my soil probe from the maintenance cart and walked the perimeter of the plot, taking readings every 18 inches. That was a Thursday morning in October. That was where it started. Calvary Ridge Cemetery sits on 42 acres of rolling ground on the east side of Harwick, Indiana, a town of about 11,000 people between Terre Haute and Indianapolis. It's not a famous cemetery. It's not old enough to be historical or large enough to be institutional. It opened in 1952, and by the time I started working there, it had somewhere around 8,000 occupied plots, with room for maybe 4,000 more. Sections A through N, organized in a grid that follows the original survey lines of the property, interrupted by a row of older oaks along the eastern edge and a drainage swale that runs through the middle of Section F and causes me more work than anything else on the property. I'd been there 6 years when the Van grave started. My title was Grounds Maintenance Supervisor, which meant I had one part-time assistant in the busy seasons and no one else the rest of the year. I handled mowing, trimming, irrigation maintenance, drainage, monument cleaning, plot preparation for upcoming burials, and general upkeep. The cemetery director, a woman named Helen Pratt, handled the administrative side, family arrangements, record keeping, the funeral home coordination, the billing. We worked out of a small office building near the main entrance that also served as the family consultation room. I liked the job. That's not a complicated thing to explain. Some people find cemetery work morbid, and some people find it peaceful, and I was in the second group. The grounds were quiet. The work was physical and clear. You could see what you'd done at the end of a day. I'd done landscaping work before this job and groundskeeping at a county park, and the cemetery wasn't fundamentally different from either of those, except that the clients didn't complain and the timeline was forgiving. The morning I found plot 1114C was a standard Thursday. I'd been doing my weekly inspection walk of Section L, which was where the newer burials were concentrated. Dolores Van had been put in 114C in July, one of the later summer burials. She was 81 years old at death, widow, the grave purchased by her daughter who lived in Indianapolis. Standard everything: burial vault, standard casket package, granite marker with her name and dates. Born 1941, died July 14th. The marker had a small cross etched above the name, which was common, and the date of death was followed by the phrase, "at rest," which was also common. I'd filled that grave myself. I'd been present for the burial. I knew the ground there. What I was looking at was not settling. Settling happens in the months after a burial, as the disturbed soil compresses under its own weight and under weather. Settling looks like a slight depression forming over the plot. What I was looking at was the opposite: elevation, displacement outward. The center of the plot was slightly raised, and the perimeter had cracked along fault lines that ran radially from the center, like someone had put a hand under the plot from below and pushed up. I took my soil probe readings. The ground was normally compact at depth. This was October, dry September behind us, the water table well down. The probe hit resistance at the expected depths. Nothing unusual in the soil column itself. I stood up and looked at the grave again. Then I looked at the graves around it. 114C, 115C, 112D, the whole section. All settled normally, no disturbance. Just 14C. My first working explanation was drainage. The Section L grade runs slightly toward the swale on the east side, and occasionally a buried drainage tile will back up during heavy rain events. and pressurized the surrounding soil. We'd had a significant rain in late September, about 3 inches in 2 days. It was possible some drainage interaction at depth had created an upward pressure event in one localized spot. Possible. Not likely. The tile system wasn't near 114C, but possible enough that I didn't call Helen immediately. I filled out a maintenance note, took my photographs, and went back to the office to check the drainage map. The nearest buried tile was 40 yards from the van plot, not a drainage issue. I went back in the afternoon with a long-handled spade and carefully removed the displaced surface soil, redistributed it properly, tamped it down, and raked it smooth. I staked a small flag at the corner of the plot, so I'd remember to check it on my next walk. I didn't mention it to Helen that day. The second time was 11 days later, different in 3 ways from the first. First, the displacement was larger, not just the perimeter ring. The entire surface of the plot was elevated, the center maybe 4 inches above grade. Second, there were cracks. Vertical cracks in the soil, running from the surface down. I inserted a thin metal rod into one, and it went 18 inches before hitting resistance. The cracks were not random. They followed the edges of the burial vault below, which told me the vault itself was involved in the upward movement. Third, there were no tool marks, no shovel cuts, no boot impressions in the soft perimeter soil. Whatever had moved the earth had moved it from below. I sat on my heels at the edge of the plot for a long time. A burial vault is a concrete or polymer outer container placed in the grave before the casket is lowered. Its purpose is to prevent the ground from collapsing under the weight of the equipment and to protect the casket from soil pressure. A standard vault weighs between 900 and 1,200 pounds. It's placed in the ground, the casket is lowered inside it, and the lid is set on top. The lid is not fastened. It rests by gravity and is then covered with soil. For the vault lid to be pushing upward against 900 pounds of soil, something would have to be pushing it from inside, or something would have to be pushing the entire vault, lid, base, casket, everything, upward through the soil. Either scenario required force that I couldn't account for. I called Helen. She came out and looked at it. She was a practical woman, early 50s, had been running the cemetery for 12 years, and before that had worked at a funeral home in Fort Wayne. She looked at the displaced soil and the cracks, and then she looked at me. Animals, she said. I thought that first time, but there's no channel, no entry point. And look at the direction of movement. I pointed to the radial cracks. This is pushing up, not digging in. She crouched and looked at the cracks. She inserted her finger into one, the way people do when they're trying to understand something physical. 11 days since you filled it last time. 11 days. She stood up and brushed off her knee. I'm going to call the funeral home. Find out who handled the burial and what vault was used. There might be a product defect issue. Some of the polymer vaults from certain manufacturers have had problems with pressure retention. That was a rational explanation. I hadn't thought of it, but it was reasonable. Certain vault designs trap gas, and if a body generates sufficient decomposition gas in a sealed environment, you can get pressure events. It's not common, but it happens. I told her that sounded right, and we should check it. She went back to the office, and I repaired the plot again. This time I compacted the soil in layers, using the plate compactor from the equipment shed, putting real weight back into the grade. Helen called Meridian Funeral Home that afternoon. They confirmed the vault type, a standard concrete Wilbert model, not polymer, not one of the defect-affected manufacturers. Concrete vaults don't trap gas the same way. The lid is not fully sealed. She told me, and we both sat with it for a moment. I'll monitor it, I said. Okay, she said. Let me know. I started checking 1114C every morning. First thing, before I did anything else. 7 days went by without incident. The soil stayed flat, the way I'd left it. I started thinking maybe the compaction had done something structural, that whatever had been happening had been related to a void in the fill soil, and the compaction had closed it. On the 8th day, I came around the row of markers in section L and stopped. The soil was up again. But not just up this time. There was a gap. A physical gap, along the north edge of the plot, where the surface had separated from itself. A crack wide enough to put 3 fingers into, running the full width of the plot's north border. Not a surface crack, a gap, meaning there was open space below it. I got down and looked into it with my flashlight. I could see the top of the vault lid about 14 inches down. The soil above the vault had lifted and then separated, the way a blister separates from skin. The vault lid itself, a concrete slab roughly the size and weight of a dining table, was visibly higher than it should have been. Not by much, an inch, maybe 2. But it was sitting higher in the grave than when it had been placed. I photographed it. I photographed the gap from 3 angles, including a shot with a measuring tape showing the width. Then I went and got a long rod and slid it carefully down into the gap alongside the vault wall, probing for the bottom of the vault base. The rod went down alongside the vault until I felt the base. Then I slowly worked it under the base edge and felt nothing. Air. The vault base was not in full contact with the grave floor. Some section of the base had lifted off the bottom of the grave. I withdrew the rod and sat back. A concrete burial vault weighs over 900 pounds. The casket inside adds another 200 to 400. The soil above adds several hundred more. Something had lifted that combined weight, over 1,000 pounds of material, upward by an inch or 2, creating a gap between the vault base and the grave floor. I'm a practical person. I've worked outdoors my whole career. I have a reasonable understanding of soil mechanics, drainage pressure, root systems, and the various ways that the ground can move over time. I could not explain what I was looking at. I went to find Henry. Henry Briggs had been at Calvary Ridge since 1987. He was the previous ground supervisor, retired in 2019 when his knees gave out, but he still lived in Harwick and came by occasionally, to talk to Helen, to walk the grounds, to check on whatever we were doing with the equipment. He was 71, thin, wore the same style of Carhartt jacket regardless of season, and knew this cemetery the way some people know the layout of their own house. He didn't need to look at the section maps. He knew where everything was from memory. I'd called him before for institutional knowledge, things like why the Section F drainage behaved the way it did, or where the old maintenance records from the 90s were filed. He was always willing to talk. I called him that morning and asked if he could come by. He arrived at 10. I walked him to 114C. He stood at the edge and looked at the gap and the elevated soil without touching anything. His expression didn't change dramatically. Henry's expressions never changed dramatically, but something in it went careful. "When did this start?" he said. "About 3 weeks ago. This is the 3rd occurrence. Each time it's more pronounced." I showed him the photos on my phone, starting from the first Thursday. He scrolled through them slowly. When he got to the gap photo, he stopped and looked at it for a long time. "Van," he said, reading the marker. "Dolores Van. Buried July 14th. I know when she was buried," he said, which surprised me, because Henry hadn't been active at the cemetery since 2019, and Dolores Van had only come in this July. Then he handed me back my phone and looked at the grave. "What can you tell me about Dolores Van?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do the records show?" 81 at death, widow. Daughter handled the arrangements. No unusual burial instructions in the file that Helen mentioned. "Check the original plot assignment," he said. "What do you mean?" "The plot number, 114C. Check whether that was the original assignment when the family purchased it, or whether it was changed." He looked at me evenly. "The cemetery records will have a purchase history. Check whether the family originally bought a different plot and then changed it before the burial." I hadn't known to look for that. Why would that matter? He looked at the grave once more, then looked at the row of normal graves around it. "Come find me when you've checked," he said, and he walked back toward the parking lot. I went straight to the office. The cemetery's plot purchase records went back to the opening of the grounds in 1952, digitized in the late 90s from the original paper ledgers. Helen had a record system that tracked every transaction: purchase, assignment, transfer, any changes. I pulled up the Van family account. Dolores Van's plot had been purchased by her daughter, Karen Van Holloway, on June 3rd. The purchase date was about 6 weeks before the death, which was not unusual. Families sometimes purchased in advance when a death was anticipated. The original purchase record showed Plot 221G, Section N, the newer section on the west side of the property. Standard location, nothing unusual. On July 10th, 4 days before the burial date, there was a modification record. The plot assignment had been changed from 221G to 114C. The modification had been requested, according to the record, by the deceased herself. The note in the system said, "Decedent request, plot preference change. Verbal request relayed through family. Per decedent, plot 1114C specifically requested." Dolores Van had died on July 14th. The plot change had been entered on July 10th. If the change had been relayed through the family, and Dolores had been alive on July 10th, still alive enough to make a verbal request, then she had specifically asked to be buried in plot 114C, not in the plot her family had chosen. In that specific plot, in Section L, on the east side of the grounds. I looked at the record for a long time. Then I checked what had been in 114C before Dolores Van. The plot history showed it had been purchased in 2001 and had remained empty for 22 years before Dolores Van was assigned to it in July. Empty for 22 years. Purchased in 2001, never used. I looked at who had purchased it in 2001. The purchaser name was listed as Raymond Van, Dolores Van's late husband. Raymond Van had purchased plot 114C in 2001, and it had sat empty and paid for until his wife specifically requested to be buried there. 22 years later, I printed the records and went to find Henry. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot. He hadn't left. He was drinking coffee from a thermos and looking at the grounds with the expression of a man who had been waiting to find out whether his suspicion was right. I showed him the printout. He read it. He nodded once. "Raymond Van," I said. "He purchased the plot in 2001. Was he buried here?" "No," Henry said. "I didn't see a record for him. He's not here." He took a long drink from the thermos. Raymond Van died in March of 2001. He died in a house fire on Clematis Street, over on the north side of town. I remember it because it was the week after I dealt with a family dispute over a different plot, and I remember thinking at least this one was straightforward. He paused. His remains were cremated because of the condition of the body. His wife had the ashes interred at a columbarium in Indianapolis. He's not at Calvary Ridge, but he bought the plot here. He bought it 2 weeks before he died. Henry set the thermos on the dashboard. March of 2001. He bought 114C. He died March 19th. The plot sat in his name, then transferred to his wife's estate. He looked at me. Dolores Van kept paying the annual maintenance fee on an empty plot for 22 years. Every year, the invoice went to her address, and she paid it. I thought about that. A woman paying to maintain an empty grave for over 2 decades. A grave her husband had purchased weeks before his death and never used. And then, when she was dying herself, specifically requesting to be buried in that plot. "Why?" I said. Henry picked up the thermos again. "That's what I'd like to know. Is there anything in the maintenance records? Anything from those 22 years that I should look at?" He was quiet for a moment. "Go look in the physical file cabinet in the back room, the one with the brown folders. There's a folder for Section L, and inside it, there should be a maintenance log going back to when I started the digital records, around 2005 or so. Before that, it's paper ledgers." He paused. "Look for any notes on 114C. I asked if he was coming in. He said he'd wait. The back room was where we kept the physical archives, old plot maps, maintenance logs, correspondence with monument companies, equipment warranties. The brown folders were section maintenance records, organized by letter. I pulled the L folder. The maintenance log was a printed sheet that had been added to over the years with handwritten notes. Most entries were routine: mowing schedule, marker cleaning dates, drainage notes, seasonal notes about the oak tree roots near the east border. I went through it page by page, looking for any reference to plot 114C. I found one. Dated September 14th, 2009. The handwriting was Henry's. The note said, 14C surface disturbance found during morning inspection. Plot is unoccupied. No sign of vandalism or animal activity. Soil redistributed and compacted. Flagged for monitoring. I stood at the filing cabinet and read it twice. Surface disturbance. Unoccupied plot. No sign of vandalism or animal activity. In 2009, when the plot contained nothing, no vault, no casket, no body, the soil had been disturbed. I kept reading. 3 pages later, also in Henry's handwriting, dated November 2nd, 2009, 114C, second disturbance. Pattern similar to September event. Soil displaced upward from apparent central point. Plot remains unoccupied. No explanation found. Discussed with Director Margaret Oakes then. No action taken beyond repair. Monitoring continues. And then one more. Dated March 8, 2010, 114C. No further disturbances since November. Closing active monitoring. Plot maintenance to resume standard schedule. I photographed all 3 entries with my phone and went back to the parking lot. Henry read the photos on my screen. He took his time. "You wrote those," I said. "I did. The plot was empty in 2009. Nothing in the ground, and the soil was being displaced upward." "Yes." "What did you think it was?" He handed the phone back. "I thought it was a drainage issue that I couldn't locate. Then I thought it was root intrusion from the oak section on the east side. Then I thought it was something in the soil composition of that specific area, some kind of geological anomaly in the clay layer." He looked at the grounds. None of those explained it fully, but they were close enough that I could file it and move on. The disturbances stopped in November 2009 and didn't come back, so I stopped thinking about it. Until now. Until now. He started his truck. "I'll tell you what I told myself in 2009. There is a practical procedure for this. When a plot behaves this way, you compact the soil, you flag it, and you check it daily. You do not dig it up without a legal reason and a funeral director present. You do not go into the ground unless the cemetery director authorizes it. Those are the rules." "Those are the official rules," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "There's one more. Unofficial. The directors I worked under, Margaret Oakes, and the man before her, Gerald Farrow, both told me the same thing when I first started, back in '87. He put the truck in reverse. "If a plot that's behaving this way is occupied, you don't go into the ground without checking first whether the death record and the burial record are the same document." "What does that mean?" He backed out of the space. Through the window, he said, "It means make sure the person you buried is the person who's supposed to be buried there." He drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a minute, then went back inside to the records. The death record on file for Dolores Vann was a photocopy of the Indiana State death certificate. Standard procedure, we kept a copy with the burial file. It listed her name, her date of death, her date of birth, the attending physician, the cause of death, the funeral home. The burial record was the internal form completed by Helen at the time of interment, listing the plot number, the vault type, the casket, the date, the time, the funeral home representative present. I read them side by side. Everything matched. Dolores Vann, born 1941, died July 14th. Same name, same dates, same everything. But something made me look at the death certificate more carefully. The cause of death was listed as cardiopulmonary failure, with a secondary notation of advanced stage renal disease. Standard. The attending physician was a Dr. Franklin Marsh at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis. I looked at the address block on the certificate. Dolores Vann's residence at the time of death was listed as a street address in Indianapolis. I looked at the plot purchase record from 2001. Raymond Vann had purchased plot 114C from Calvary Ridge Cemetery in Harwick, Indiana, a town she'd apparently not lived in, based on her Indianapolis address on the death certificate. That wasn't necessarily strange. People bought plots in their hometowns or their families' hometowns, even when they'd moved away. Raymond and Dolores Van might have had a connection to Harwick from earlier in their lives, but I didn't know what that connection was, and the records didn't say. I wrote down Franklin Marsh, MD. I wrote down the address from the death certificate. I wrote down the secondary physician listed on the certificate, a Dr. Kim, no first name, just consulting physician. Then I went back out to 114C. The gap I'd found that morning was still there. I'd left it, for once, without repairing it immediately. I crouched at the edge and pointed my flashlight down into the gap again, at the top of the vault lid. The vault lid was concrete, standard grey, no markings on the exposed surface, which was normal. I was about to stand up when I saw it. On the top surface of the vault lid, in the section visible through the gap, there was a mark. A scrape. Not old. The concrete around it was the same weathered grey as the rest, but the scrape itself was lighter in colour, the way fresh concrete damage looks. A recent mark. The mark was on the top surface of the vault lid, the surface that faced upward, toward the soil, toward the underside of the disturbed earth. If the mark was recent, and it looked recent, then something had scraped against the top of that vault lid from above. That would mean something had been in the soil between the lid surface and the ground surface, pressing down from above, and had left a mark as it moved. Or the mark was from below the lid, from the underside, which would mean the lid had been raised, and something on the underside had dragged across the top surface as the lid tilted. I stared at it. The angle of the flashlight wasn't good enough to see the mark clearly. I got lower, nearly putting my face in the gap, and looked. The scrape was on the top surface, definitely. Not the underside, but there was a second mark I'd missed from the first angle. Underneath, on the inner face of the gap, on the vault wall itself, not the lid, there was a series of horizontal lines, 5 of them, spaced about an inch apart, running along the concrete surface at a height of about 8 inches above the vault base. 5 horizontal lines, parallel, evenly spaced, like someone had dragged something across the inner wall of the vault at that height, repeatedly, in the same location. I withdrew the flashlight and sat back on my heels. The marks were on the inside of the vault, the inner wall, the surface that faced the casket. My heart was doing something I didn't immediately acknowledge. I breathed through it and thought about what the marks could be. Metal contact from the casket hardware during settling and shifting. Possible. Concrete curing artifacts. Unlikely. They were too regular. Something else entirely. Something I didn't have a practical category for. I stood up. I repaired the gap, filling it with compacted soil in careful layers, the way I'd been doing. I packed it methodically and raked the surface smooth, and then I sat on the ground next to the grave with my back to the marker, and I waited. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. Something to make the decision for me, maybe. Some logical conclusion that would mean I knew what to do next. I sat there for about 15 minutes. The October morning was cool and grey, the sky a flat white, the grounds quiet. A crow crossed the oak section on the east border, landed somewhere I couldn't see, and was gone. The irrigation system clicked on in section K, 80 yards away, and ran its cycle, and clicked off. The ground in front of me was still, freshly raked, flat, the same as every other plot in the row. I was about to stand up when I heard it. A single sound, dull, low, coming from below. Not loud, about the volume of a book dropped on a carpeted floor, muffled by several feet of earth. A single impact. Not a groan, not a scrape. One knock. Then nothing. I stayed absolutely still for 30 seconds. The grounds were silent. The flat white sky. The crows. The distant sound of a car on the road outside the east fence. Nothing else. I got up and walked back to the office at a normal pace, and sat down at the desk and stared at the wall for a while. One knock. From below, a sealed burial vault and several feet of compacted soil. I could explain it. A settling sound. Vaults shift. Soil shifts. Things compress and release. A buried root cracking under pressure. Underground water movement creating a percussion effect in a clay layer. All of those things were real. All of them happened. None of them produced a single clean knock. I opened my laptop and searched for Raymond Van Harwick, Indiana. It took me a few minutes of refining the search before I found anything useful. A digitized local newspaper archive, the Harwick Courier, going back to 1985. There was one result for Raymond Van, a brief obituary, March 2001. Raymond Allen Van, 58, of Indianapolis, died March 19th in a residential fire. He is survived by his wife, Dolores Van. Mr. Van was a retired civil engineer. No local service is planned. Private arrangements are handled by the family. 58 years old, civil engineer, died in a house fire, no local service. Private arrangements. Of Indianapolis, not of Harwick. He'd had no Harwick address, no stated connection to the town. He had died a man with no local ties to this place, and he had purchased a burial plot here 2 weeks before his death. I read the obituary again, looking for anything else. There was nothing. 3 sentences. I went back to the cemetery records and looked at the Section L plot map. 114C sat in the middle of a row of similar plots, nothing distinctive about its location. But I pulled the historical map, the one showing the original 1952 survey layout, and compared it to the current map. The plot numbers in Section L had been renumbered during a records reorganization in 1998. The original designation for what was now 114C was different. In the original 1952 numbering system, the plot had been designated 88L. I cross-referenced 88L in the pre-1998 records. The pre-digital ledger was in a binder in the back room. I found the Section L pages, found the row, found the original 88L entry. The plot had been purchased once before the 2001 Raymond Van purchase. It had been purchased in 1978 by a family named Cutler. The purchase record showed 2 names, Harold Cutler and Meredith Cutler, as a companion plot, meaning the space was intended for both. Harold Cutler was listed as buried in what was now 114C on April 9, 1979. There was no corresponding burial entry for Meredith Cutler. I looked at the plot capacity. A standard companion plot held 2 caskets, one below the other. The original Harold Cutler burial would be at the lower depth. Any subsequent burial, Meredith Cutler's or Dolores Van's, would be at the upper depth. The cemetery had sold the upper depth to Raymond Van in 2001, which meant the cemetery had treated the plot as available after some point. A companion plot reverts to available status if the surviving partner doesn't use it within a certain period, or if the rights are formally released. I checked for a release record for the Cutler companion rights. Nothing in the pre-digital ledgers, nothing in the post-1998 digital system. Harold Cutler was in the lower depth of 114C. He had been there since 1979. Meredith Cutler had purchased the upper depth and never used it. And now Dolores Van was in the upper depth, in a plot her husband had bought, above a man named Harold Cutler who'd been in the ground for 45 years. I sat with the ledger open in my lap for a long time. Then I heard the front door of the office open, and Helen came in from a family consultation, and she looked at me sitting on the floor of the back room surrounded by papers, and said, "What on earth are you doing?" I looked up at her. "How much do you know about a family named Cutler?" I said. She looked at the ledger in my lap. Her expression shifted slightly. Not alarm, but the careful look of someone who has just realized a conversation is going to be more complicated than they expected. She came into the back room and closed the door behind her. "Harold Cutler," she said. "Plot 114C. You know about him. I know that Margaret Oakes, the director before me, left a note in the administrative file about that plot." She paused. I read it when I took over the directorship. I thought it was just a record-keeping anomaly. "What did the note say?" Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the desk and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been carrying something small and strange for a long time and is now deciding whether to set it down. "It said," she began carefully, "that if Plot 114C ever requires attention beyond routine maintenance, the groundskeeper should be notified that the depth measurement on the Cutler interment record may not be accurate." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that Harold Cutler, may not be at the depth the record says he's at. The office was quiet. Outside, the October grounds sat under their flat white sky, the Section L markers in their rows, the freshly raked soil of 114C smooth and still. I thought about the marks on the inner wall of the vault, 8 inches above the vault base. If Harold Cutler was not at the depth the record indicated, if he was shallower than the record said, then the upper vault and the lower vault might be closer to each other than anyone had calculated, closer enough that the marks on the inner vault wall were not made from inside Dolores Van's casket. They were made from below. Helen didn't have anything else in writing. The note from Margaret Oakes was 3 sentences on a piece of cemetery letterhead tucked into the back of the Section L administrative folder. And beyond those 3 sentences there was nothing. No explanation of why the depth measurement might be inaccurate. No indication of whether Margaret had investigated further. No date on the note. Just the 3 sentences, in Margaret's handwriting, filed where Helen had found it when she took over the directorship in 2014. I asked Helen if she'd ever contacted Margaret about it. Once, Helen said, when I first read it. She was in assisted living in Kokomo by then. She said she didn't remember writing it. A pause. She sounded confused, not guarded, but I only had the one call. Was she director here when Harold Cutler was buried? Helen thought about it. Cutler was buried in 1979. Margaret started here in 1976. She looked at the note. She would have been on staff. Maybe not director yet. I'd have to check when she took the director position. But she was here. That meant Margaret Oakes had potentially been present for the Cutler burial. Had been present when the depth was recorded. And 40-some years later, before she retired, she had left a note saying the depth measurement might be wrong, without explaining how she knew, or what the correct depth was, or what she had done about it. I thought about Henry's unofficial rule. Make sure the person you buried is the person who's supposed to be buried there. He'd said it like it was institutional knowledge, passed down through groundskeepers, something the old directors had told the old maintenance staff. Not written down, not official, just passed along. Margaret had known something about 114C, and she'd written 3 sentences and filed them in a folder and retired to Kokomo. I could understand the impulse. I wasn't sure I'd have done differently. I need to do a GPR scan of the plot, I said. Ground-penetrating radar. The county extension office loans out a unit. I've used it before for drainage work. It'll show us subsurface densities, actual vault positions, depths. Helen nodded. How soon? I can get it tomorrow morning. The extension office had the unit available. I picked it up at 7 and was at the cemetery before 8. The October morning was cold and clear. Frost still on the grass in the low sections. The oak leaves along the east border gone orange and starting to let go. I ran the GPR cart over 114C in a grid pattern. 6 passes north-south, 6 east-west. The display screen reading the subsurface in real time as layered density signatures. I did it methodically, the way I did drainage work. Cart at walking pace, passes overlapping by a foot. Display logged to the unit's internal memory for later analysis. It took about 40 minutes. Then I went to the maintenance shed with my laptop and pulled the data. The van vault showed up clearly, a dense rectangular return at approximately 42 inches, consistent with the burial record. No surprises there. Below it, where the Cutler vault should have appeared at 60 inches, the signature came back at 49, not 60, 49 inches. An 11-inch discrepancy, meaning the clearance between the base of the van vault and the top of the Cutler vault was approximately 7 inches, not the 18 inches the records implied. 7 inches of soil and concrete between 2 burial chambers. I ran the data a second time to confirm. Same result. I also found something I hadn't been looking for. Along the east wall of the Cutler vault signature, the soil density changed. A narrow vertical channel, maybe 6 inches wide in the scan, ran downward from beside the lower vault base and angled east-southeast, dropping into the deeper native soil. Not a root pattern, not a drainage tile. The signature was too regular, too deliberate. The walls of the channel too smooth in the density return. Something had passed through that soil repeatedly enough to consolidate it into a channel. Not recently. The depth and the compaction signature suggested it had been there a long time. I printed the results and brought them to Helen. She looked at the depth numbers first. 49 inches, she said. Confirmed on 2 passes. She set the printout on her desk. That means the burial record is wrong by 11 inches. Either the original crew measured incorrectly, recorded incorrectly, or... She stopped. Or the vault isn't where it was placed, I said. She looked at me. Concrete vaults don't move on their own, I said. I know that. But the 2009 maintenance log, Henry's note about the surface disturbance on an unoccupied plot, that was 15 years ago. That plot had nothing in the upper position in 2009. If something was generating upward pressure then, it could have been affecting the lower position. You're saying the Cutler vault may have moved upward, she said. I'm saying it's not at the depth the record says, and I don't have another explanation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to file a complaint with the State Board of Health. There's a formal process for burial depth discrepancies, an authorized investigation that includes a physical inspection of the grave. She looked at the printout. It's not fast, 30 to 60 days typically. And in the meantime, keep repairing the surface, keep monitoring, photograph everything. She paused. And don't go into the ground yourself, not without authorization and a funeral director present. I told her I understood. While I waited for the state process to move, I used the time to look at what I actually knew about Harold Cutler. His obituary had given me his occupation, retired surveyor. That detail had stayed with me since I'd read it. A surveyor is someone who understands soil, grade, subsurface conditions, property boundaries, depth. It was not a random profession to attach to a man buried in a grave that wasn't at the depth the record said. I went back to the Harwick Courier archive and searched more carefully. The 1971 zoning board notice listed Harold Cutler as a property owner submitting a comment on a proposed drainage easement. The nature of his comment wasn't in the article, but the topic was. A drainage easement ran through the east section of Harwick, in the vicinity of Linwood Road, where Harold Cutler had lived. His property on Linwood Road backed toward the old Calvary Ridge drainage corridor, the same swale that ran through Section F of the cemetery. I knew that swale. I spent more time managing it than almost any other feature of the grounds. It collected runoff from the higher terrain to the east and channeled it west through the cemetery property. A retired surveyor living on Linwood Road, adjacent to the drainage corridor, found unresponsive in his cellar in February 1979 and dead 6 weeks later. I pulled the Harwick street map from the county assessor's site and looked at the Linwood Road properties. The parcel that had belonged to Cutler, identified by the 1981 sale record, was about 3/4 of a mile from the east boundary of Calvary Ridge Cemetery. Not walking distance, but close enough that a surveyor who knew the local terrain would have known the cemetery's drainage situation, would have known what the ground was doing in that part of town. I thought about the channel the GPR had shown, running east-southeast from the Cutler vault, down into the deeper soil, angling in the direction of the drainage corridor. I wrote it down and looked at it for a while and didn't come to a conclusion. There was a connection there, geography, profession, timing, but I couldn't close it into something I could state clearly. On a Wednesday, 10 days after the GPR scan, I drove past the east cemetery boundary on my lunch break and turned onto Linwood Road. I knew which parcel had been Cutler's from the assessor's records. It was a modest house, white siding, a detached garage, a backyard that extended down a shallow slope toward a tree line. The current owners had a swing set in the yard and a pickup truck in the driveway. Someone else's life, completely unremarkable. I didn't stop. I drove slowly past and looked at the slope of the yard, the angle of it, the way the terrain fell toward the tree line at the back. Below that tree line, I knew from the map, was the beginning of the drainage corridor that eventually passed through Section F of the cemetery. I drove back. That afternoon, I went to the east section of the cemetery and walked the ground between 114C and the east boundary. 32 yards from the plot perimeter, Between two oak roots, I found a depression in the ground. Subtle, maybe 18 inches across, the soil compacted downward in a shallow oval. The kind of surface expression you see over a subsurface void when the material below slowly consolidates. I pressed my hand into the center of the depression. The soil gave slightly. Not unstable, but less firm than the surrounding grade. I got my soil probe and pushed it in. It went down without normal resistance. No usual layering of topsoil, subsoil, clay. At 22 inches, it dropped into open space. A void, directly in line with the channel the GPR had shown, angling east from the Cutler Vault. I didn't probe further. I marked the location with a small flag and went back to the office and looked at the GPR data again, tracing the channel line. It ran from the east wall of the Cutler Vault, down and east, in the direction of the depression I'd just found. Whatever that channel was, it connected the grave to something further into the native soil, and the void at the far end of it had been there long enough to create a surface depression. I thought about Harold Cutler in his cellar on Linwood Road in February 1979. Found unresponsive, cause listed as exposure and suspected cardiac event. The police had conducted a welfare check and found no evidence of criminal activity. What had he been doing in the cellar? A retired surveyor, a man who understood ground and depth and what lay beneath property lines, a man who lived 3/4 of a mile from a cemetery, adjacent to a drainage corridor that passed through its east section. I didn't have an answer, but I had a shape to the question that I hadn't had before. I found the Raymond Van piece by accident. I'd been trying to track down any connection between the Van family and Harwick. Some reason Raymond would have purchased a plot at Calvary Ridge in a town he apparently hadn't lived in. I searched his name in the Courier archive and found nothing. I searched civil engineering firms in the Indianapolis area from the late 1990s, trying to find any project records that might have brought him to Harwick or to the cemetery. What I found instead was a property record. Raymond Van had not lived in Harwick, but in 1998, 3 years before his death, he had purchased a parcel of land adjacent to the east boundary of Calvary Ridge Cemetery. Not a house, a vacant parcel, an undeveloped strip about 40 yards wide and 200 yards long, running along the cemetery's east fence line. He'd bought it from the estate of a man named Werner, who'd held it since the 1960s. Raymond Van, civil engineer, had owned the land directly adjacent to the cemetery's east boundary from 1998 until his death in 2001. The parcel had been sold as part of his estate to Calvary Ridge Cemetery itself, as it turned out. The cemetery had purchased it in 2003, 2 years after his death. I went to Helen with that. She pulled the property records from the cemetery's file. The 2003 purchase was there, a strip acquisition for future expansion, listed in the board minutes as a routine property addition. The selling party was the Van estate, administered by Karen Van Holloway, Dolores Van's daughter, the same woman who had arranged Dolores's burial. The land Raymond Van had purchased in 1998, and that his estate had sold to the cemetery in 2003, ran along the east boundary, directly adjacent to the oak section, directly above the drainage corridor, directly in line with the channel the GPR had shown extending east from the Cutler Vault. Helen looked at the property map for a long time. He bought land next to the cemetery, she said, 2 years before he bought plot 1114C, and 2 years before he died. I nodded. A civil engineer buying undeveloped land adjacent to a cemetery with specific subsurface conditions. Land that his estate then sold to the cemetery after his death. I paused. I think he was investigating something. I think he found the same ground anomaly I found. The depression, the void, the channel. And I think whatever he found led him to the plot. That's a lot of inference, Helen said. Yes, I said. It is. She looked at the map again. But Dolores lived until this July, 22 years after Raymond died, and she spent those 22 years paying maintenance fees on an empty plot. Waiting, I said. For what? I didn't have an answer for that. What does a person wait 22 years to do? What does a woman whose husband died in a house fire, who paid to maintain a grave he never occupied, Request on her deathbed with enough clarity that it gets noted in a cemetery record. She wanted to be there, in that specific plot, above Harold Cutler. Whether she wanted it out of understanding, or grief, or something else entirely, I didn't know. On October 19th, 18 days after my first discovery, and 8 days after the GPR scan, I arrived at the cemetery at 7 and drove the maintenance cart to Section L. The surface of 114C was elevated again, the familiar radial cracking, the center raised, the perimeter displaced outward, but larger this time, more pronounced than any previous event. The center of the plot was 6 inches above grade, and the perimeter cracks had widened to nearly an inch in several places. I crouched at the widest crack, on the north edge, and looked down with my flashlight. The vault lid was visible below, but something was different about the surface of the lid. I adjusted the angle of the flashlight and looked more carefully. The marks. I'd seen 5 horizontal marks on the inner wall of the Cutler vault through the inspection camera. Marks I'd been told were made from below, based on their position on the interior concrete surface. I'd been thinking about those marks since the day I saw them. Their spacing, their regularity, the way they ran parallel across the concrete face, at a height of about 8 inches above the vault base. Now, looking down through the surface crack at the top of the van vault lid, I saw marks on the upper surface of the lid that hadn't been there during my last inspection. The same type, horizontal, parallel, running across the concrete surface. 3 of them, spaced about an inch apart. Not on the inner wall this time, on the outer top surface of the van vault lid, the side that faced upward, toward the soil, toward the surface. I took photographs from every angle the crack allowed. Then I sat back and thought about what the marks meant in relation to each other. 5 marks on the interior wall of the lower vault, Cutler's vault, positioned 8 inches above the vault base, running horizontally across the inner face. 3 marks on the outer top surface of the upper vault, the van vault, running horizontally across the concrete. The lower marks were on the inside of the lower vault. The upper marks were on the outside top of the upper vault. Both sets horizontal. Both sets on the surfaces that faced toward each other, toward the 7-inch gap between the 2 vaults. Whatever had made those marks had been in the space between the 2 vaults, or moving between them. I got the inspection camera from the maintenance shed and returned to the plot. The crack was wide enough on the north edge to thread the camera cable down, alongside the vault wall. I lowered it carefully, watching the feed on my phone. The vault wall came into view, the soil alongside the wall, the base of the van vault, and then the gap, the 7-inch space between the lower surface of the van vault and the upper surface of the Cutler vault below. I positioned the camera to look horizontally into the gap. The space was occupied. I held the phone steady and looked at what the camera was showing me. There was something in the gap, pale against the dark concrete on either side, an irregular shape, compressed into the space, flattened against the underside of the van vault above it. I adjusted the LED brightness and the camera angle. The shape resolved slightly. Long and narrow in one section, wider and more irregular at the far edge of the frame. My brain was working to categorize it. Root intrusion, debris, some kind of material that had migrated through the soil, and running out of categories that fit. The narrow section near the center of the frame looked like fingers. I moved the camera a fraction. The image shifted. 5 fingers, a palm, the heel of a hand, pressing upward against the underside of the vault above it, pale, the skin intact, the pressure even and sustained. I held the camera still for a long moment, a human hand, or something shaped like one, pressed into the 7-inch gap between 2 burial vaults, 6 feet underground, pushing upward against 1,000 pounds of concrete. I took a screenshot. Then I moved the camera east, toward the edge of the vault, trying to see further into the gap. At the far edge of the frame, where the camera angle and the light gave out, there was something else. I couldn't identify it with confidence. Another shape, further back, at the limit of the LED reach, paler than the surrounding concrete, the same general impression of something organized rather than random. I moved the camera slightly, and the shape shifted at the margin of resolution. I looked at it for a long moment, and I honestly could not tell what I was seeing. It might have been another hand. It might have been a trick of the light and the angle, and my own expectation. It was at the edge of what the camera could show me, and I wasn't willing to state it as a fact. I withdrew the camera carefully. I sat at the edge of the plot and looked at the screenshot on my phone. The hand, clear in the center of the image, the fingers pressed flat, the pressure visible in the slight whitening of the skin at the contact points against the concrete above. And then, as I was looking at the still image, I saw something I hadn't registered while I was watching the live feed. At the edge of the frame, the index finger of the hand was not fully flat against the vault surface. There was a gap, thin, barely visible, between the tip of the finger and the concrete above it. A gap that hadn't been in the same position as the rest of the fingers. I looked at it for a long time and tried to remember whether that gap had been in the live feed or whether the screenshot had captured a moment of movement, a moment where one finger had lifted, just the tip, just a fraction, and then pressed back. I couldn't be certain. The image was still. I'd been watching a camera feed in dim light at the bottom of a narrow gap, and my attention had been split between holding the camera steady and reading the screen. But the gap was there, at the tip of the index finger. I thought about the knock I'd heard 3 days earlier. The single dull impact from below the soil surface. I thought about what it sounds like when someone presses a finger against a hard surface and lifts it. The sound it would make muffled through 7 inches of space and several feet of soil. I put my phone in my pocket. Helen was in the office when I came back. I showed her the screenshot. She looked at it without speaking for long enough that I counted the seconds. 8, 9, 10, before she set the phone on the desk. "I'm calling the state board today," she said. "Not a standard complaint. I'm requesting an emergency inspection on structural grounds. The surface displacement creates a safety hazard for cemetery visitors. That gets us a faster response." "How fast?" 3 to 5 days, instead of 30. She looked at the phone on her desk without picking it up again. "They'll send a licensed inspector and a representative from a funeral home. The grave will need to be opened under supervision." "Opened how far?" "Enough to assess the vault integrity. Potentially enough to inspect the Cutler burial, if the depth discrepancy warrants it." She paused. "I'm going to tell them about the depth issue on the call. That gives them justification to go deeper if needed." I nodded. "And tonight? Tonight we cover the opening. Safety stakes and tape at minimum. Tarps over the surface displacement." She looked at me. "And you go home." I went to the equipment shed and got the orange safety stakes and the roll of barrier tape, the standard equipment for a compromised plot. I staked a perimeter 6 feet out from the plot boundary and ran the tape, then laid a tarp over the surface and weighted it at the corners. The October light was going by the time I finished. The cemetery was quiet. A family had been visiting a plot in Section K earlier in the afternoon, but they were gone now. Just the grounds and the cooling air, and the staked perimeter of 114C with its weighted tarp. I stood at the tape line and looked at the tarp for a moment. 7 inches. Then something. Then the lower vault. Then whatever was below that. Harold Cutler, buried April 1979. In the ground for 45 years. A retired surveyor who had understood this ground, who had lived nearby, who had perhaps found a channel in the earth that led somewhere, and who had ended up in a cellar unresponsive and been dead 6 weeks later. Dolores Vann, buried July of this year. A woman who had paid to maintain an empty plot for 22 years, and who had spent the last days of her life making sure she ended up here, above whatever was in the lower vault. And Raymond Vann, who had bought the land adjacent to this cemetery, and the plot within it, before dying in a house fire, with no obvious local connection to Harwick. Who had been a civil engineer, someone who understood load, depth, structural behavior of soil and concrete. What had Raymond found in that strip of land? What had he seen in the ground that made him buy the plot? What had he known or suspected that had led his wife to spend 22 years honoring a decision he'd made 2 weeks before his death? I didn't know. I wasn't sure the state inspector on Saturday would know either. You can open a grave and document what's in it. You can measure depths and record physical evidence. But the part that mattered, why these people, why this plot, what the connection was between a surveyor dead in 1979 and a civil engineer dead in 2001, and a woman who wanted to be buried above both of them, that was not in any record I'd found. I went back to the office to get my jacket and keys. Before I left, I pulled up the GPR data one more time. The channel running east from the Cutler Vault. The void I'd found 32 yards out, between the oak roots. I looked at the density signature of the channel walls, the smooth, consolidated quality that indicated repeated passage over time. I measured the angle on the scan. East-southeast, dropping at roughly 20 degrees from horizontal as it moved away from the vault. I traced the line on the map. East-southeast, from 114C, 20 degrees down, past the oak section, past the East Cemetery boundary, toward Linwood Road, toward the property that had belonged to Harold Cutler. I looked at that line for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop and went home. I woke at 4 in the morning without knowing why. Not a noise. The house was quiet, the neighborhood quiet. Just suddenly awake, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the night, before the ordinary thoughts arrive. I lay in the dark and thought about the 5 marks. 5 horizontal marks on the inner wall of the Cutler Vault. The spacing had been about an inch between each. They were positioned 8 inches above the vault base. 8 inches, the approximate height of a human hand held sideways, from the base of the palm to the tip of the middle finger. Not an inch above the base, not at mid-height, 8 inches above the base, which was where a hand would rest if someone inside the vault was lying on their back and reaching sideways, dragging fingers along the inner wall. 5 marks, 5 parallel lines. I thought about what you would feel, in the dark, inside a sealed concrete vault, if you were trying to locate the wall. If you were trying to understand the dimensions of the space, you'd reach sideways and drag your hand across the surface. You'd do it more than once. Each pass would leave a line. 5 passes, 5 lines. I stopped that line of thinking because it led somewhere I wasn't ready to go at 4 in the morning. But it also explained the 3 marks on the upper surface of the van vault, 3 passes across the surface above the gap, reaching up through the 7-inch space. 3 marks. Not 5. A smaller number. Less room to work in. A 7-inch gap is barely enough to extend a hand, let alone move it freely. I got up and made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with the GPR printout and the photographs I'd taken over the past 3 weeks. The state inspector was coming Saturday. It was now Thursday, 30-some hours. I thought about Margaret Oakes writing 3 sentences on a piece of letterhead and filing it in a folder, instead of making a phone call. I thought about Henry Briggs's unofficial rule. Check whether the person you buried is the person who's supposed to be there. I thought about the 2009 maintenance log, a surface disturbance on an empty plot, filed and forgotten. Each of the people who had known something about 114C had found a way to put distance between themselves and the knowledge. Margaret had filed a note and retired. Henry had compacted the soil and stopped monitoring. The director before Margaret, Gerald Farrow, whose name appeared in old correspondence, had presumably known about the Cutler burial and said nothing that survived in any record. I wasn't sure Saturday was going to provide the kind of answer that resolved anything. The inspector would document the depth discrepancy. The funeral home representative would assess vault integrity. The state would generate a report. And whatever was in that 7-inch gap between 2 concrete vaults in Section L of Calvary Ridge Cemetery would either be documented or it wouldn't, and the report would be filed, and someone would decide what to do next. What I knew, sitting at my kitchen table at 4 in the morning, was simpler than any of that. Something was in that gap. Something was pressing upward against concrete. Something had left marks on the surfaces around it, and had been doing so for long enough that the marks were in multiple locations. Whether it was Harold Cutler, or the evidence of Harold Cutler's last movements before something else happened, or something that had nothing to do with Harold Cutler, I didn't know. I'm not sure anyone did. I looked at the screenshot on my phone one more time. The hand, pressed flat. the fingers spread, the index finger with its barely visible gap at the tip, the thing I might have seen move, or might have imagined seeing move, in the moment between the live feed and the still image. At the edge of the frame, the other shape, the pale, ambiguous form at the limit of the camera's reach. I zoomed in on it. The resolution degraded, the image broke into blocks, and I lost whatever definition had been there. I couldn't tell what it was. I had looked at it a dozen times since yesterday, and I still couldn't tell. My brain kept trying to organize it into something recognizable, and kept arriving at a shape that I didn't want to confirm as a shape. I put the phone down. The investigation was Saturday morning. I would be there when the inspector arrived. I would bring my documentation, the maintenance log going back to Henry's 2009 note, the GPR data, the photographs, the records on the Cutler burial depth discrepancy. I would walk them through what I knew, in the order that I'd learned it, and whatever they found when they opened the grave, I would document that too. Outside my kitchen window, the town of Harwick was still dark and quiet. A few miles east, Calvary Ridge Cemetery sat on its 42 acres, the Section L plots in their rows, the orange safety tape, around 114C, moving slightly in the October wind, the weighted tarp holding down whatever was pressing upward beneath it. I thought about Harold Cutler finding something in the ground on Linwood Road and ending up in his cellar. I thought about Raymond Van buying the land beside the cemetery and the plot within it, and dying 2 weeks later. I thought about Dolores Van paying maintenance fees for 22 years on an empty grave, and the patience that required, and what kind of certainty would sustain that kind of patience. I didn't sleep again before dawn. I sat at the table with my coffee and waited for the light to come. That concludes tonight's file. If you've ever experienced something strange or unexplained, I'd love to hear your story. You can share it in the comments or send it to the email in the description. It might become a future case on Midnight Files. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join me for more documentary-style horror stories. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones we never forget.